In the years when the Iron Throne gleamed like gold while rotting from within, one of the king's bastard sons was born. They named him Brynden Rivers, but the realm would remember him not as a man, but as a shadow, Bloodraven. Even in the cradle, there was something about him that felt wrong, ill-omened, impossible to forget. His pale skin, his near-colorless hair, his blood-red eyes, and the red mark carved across his face set him apart from the other children of the court. Some saw only a bastard in him, some saw an evil sign. But before long, Westeros would come to understand one thing. This child had been born as one of the king's shames, yet he would become one of the darkest fates ever to fall upon the dynasty. For the story of Bloodraven is not merely the rise of a bastard prince. It is the story of a dynasty turning brother against brother, of a civil war sealed in arrows, of the unseen fear that keeps kings standing, and at last, of a man slipping out of history and into legend. The boy once born in the shadow of the court would, in time, become the coldest gaze behind the crowns. And then, in the silence of the north, he would be drawn into a darkness older than the memory of man. Before we sink into the story, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this video from right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. And now, let's return to the marked child born in the shadow of the Iron Throne. His father was King Aegon the Fourth of the Seven Kingdoms. His mother was Melissa Blackwood of House Blackwood, the woman the court called Missy. Even in the cradle, the child seemed to carry the pale ghost of Targaryen blood upon him, skin close to milk white, hair nearly stripped of all color, and red eyes so striking they unsettled anyone who lingered on them too long. But what truly set him apart was not that pallor alone. The red birthmark he bore across his face and body felt like the first seed of the name that would one day become legend. Some took it for the mark of ill fortune, some for the seal of fate, some simply feared it. For some children are merely born into the world, while others seem as if they were chosen long before they ever drew breath. Even in swaddling clothes, Brynden Rivers carried the feeling of the second kind, as though the redness written across his flesh was not merely a stain upon the skin, but an unread sentence from the future. His mother, Melissa Blackwood, was not some name lost among the countless passing desires of Aegon the Fourth. She had been more than a brief amusement at court. For a time, she was one of the women who truly held the king's attention, and that meant Brynden was never merely some hidden bastard, tucked away in a forgotten tower, his name left unspoken. He may have been denied the crown entirely, but he was raised within the shadow of it. He grew up close to the king's world, amid court gossip, silk curtains, secretive glances, jealousies, and silent calculations. In the air of his childhood, intrigue hung as thickly as the scent of wine soaked into the stone walls. For the court of Aegon the Fourth was a place that shone like gold from the outside, while inside it slowly rotted everyone it touched. To be born in such a court was to be close not only to privilege, but to danger as well. Anyone near the king was either a tool to be used, a rival to be envied, or a burden to be cast aside when the moment came. Brynden may not have had the words for this as a child, but in places like that, children learn before they understand. They learn which doors conceal false smiles, at which tables laughter rings as sharply as hatred, and which glances may one day turn into swords. So Brynden Rivers did not grow up as some forgotten bastard son. He grew into a child shaped by the dangerous pull of the Iron Throne itself. He was not outside the center. On the contrary, he stood in a place far too close to it to ever trust it. And yet, the blood in his veins did not belong to the king's court alone. His mother bore the name Blackwood, and that alone was enough to cast a shadow around Brynden older than the court, darker than crowns, deeper than the games of dynasties. The Blackwoods were a house rooted along the riverbanks and in the silence of the old gods. In their world, grandeur did not live in the polished stone of the Red Keep, but in damp earth, in the whisper of leaves, in forgotten vows, and in hatreds too ancient to die. The Targaryen court belonged to fire, spectacle, the splendor of bloodlines, and the hunger to rule. The Blackwood inheritance was colder, darker, older. It was the kind of inheritance that did not mark the face, but the spine. The clash of those two worlds created a strange tension in Brynden from the very beginning. On one side stood the royal circle of dragon blood, dazzling, hungry, enamored with itself, and always half inclined toward its own destruction. On the other was that quieter, shadowed, more ancient echo that came through his mother's line. There was no need to overstate it, for Brynden's childhood had not yet descended into the darkest passages of legend, and yet it was still possible to sense that his roots did not reach only into throne rooms. It was as if this child, born beneath the golden light of the court, was always looking upon the world from within an older night, from somewhere colder, older, and deeper than the lies people tell one another. And over all of it hung the true source of the poison that would seep through the entire story. Aegon the Fourth himself, a king who ruled not with the discipline of power, but with its appetite. He stained his reign not with justice, but with desire. His tables were full, his bed was full, his treasury overflowed, and his court carried all the weight of splendor. But wealth and fear alone are not what keep a dynasty standing. Under Aegon, the house of Targaryen began to sicken, slowly and deeply. In his court, loyalty could be bought, love was treated with contempt, and even legitimacy became a plaything for personal ambition. Lust, pride, jealousy, and indifference, these were not merely the failings of one king. They were poisons poured into the future of an entire dynasty. Brynden Rivers was born into such a house, or rather, not a house at all, but a structure already collapsing from within. In that place, everyone stood close to one another, yet no one was ever truly safe. Children were not merely branches on a family tree. They were tomorrow's threats, possibilities, and bargaining pieces. Aegon's weaknesses did not remain the private shame of his personal life. They seeped into the veins of the realm. Every new mistress, every new bastard, every new favored woman opened another crack in the walls of the court. The king's pleasures devoured the order of the dynasty. His careless affections gave birth to the hatreds of the future. The private excess of a ruler was beginning to harden into the political fate of a kingdom. For around Aegon the Fourth, it was not only children who were growing up, but children who would one day become legend. These were no ordinary bastard offspring. Time would remember them as the great bastards, as though each of them, though born outside legitimacy, had still forced history to make room for them. Brynden was only one among them, but he was never merely a name. Around him, other stars were rising as well, bound to him by the same father, yet sharpened against one another by fate. Among them, one of the brightest, most obvious, and most dangerous was Daemon, the boy who would later bear the name Blackfyre. He was the kind of figure who drew men to him through beauty, through a warrior's nature, through the easy appearance of nobility. Then there was Aegor Rivers, born of bracken blood, hard-edged, severe, a boy whose pride was as straight and unbending as a sword, and sheer a sea star, the girl who burned with a separate radiance amid the court's rumors, glances, desires, and whispers that moved like prophecy. These children had all been born from the same king's shadow, yet none of them was merely a reflection of the others. Each carried a different possibility of disaster. Each felt like the flesh and blood consequence of one man's boundless excess. So a new mythology began to gather around House Targaryen. On one side stood the legitimate line of the throne. On the other stood the children born of the king's desire, yet born for nothing ordinary. The court could not ignore them, because they were too striking for that, but it could not fully claim them either, because their very existence seemed like a challenge to the order itself. And so, the great bastards stood neither wholly inside nor wholly outside. They were not cracks hidden away in the side chambers of the dynasty, but fractures spreading through its very soul. And Brynden Rivers, with his pale face and crimson mark, began to seem like the quietest and most unsettling of them all. Some were remembered for their beauty, some for their ambition. Brynden, from the very beginning, was remembered for his gaze, his silence, and the marked face no one could forget. The seed of one of his greatest future enmities was planted in those years, long before the calls to war began, long before banners were raised. The tension between Aegon Rivers and Brynden Rivers cannot be explained merely by the rivalries of two bastard sons, or by competing claims upon their father's favor and the future of the dynasty. Beneath it lay something older, the ancient feud between Blackwood and Bracken, that unending hostility of the Riverlands, passed from one generation to the next, worked into the soil and into memory itself. Brynden carried Blackwood blood through his mother. Aegor came from the Bracken line, and so the tension between them was never merely personal. It was as if the unfinished hatred of their ancestors had found new bodies in which to live. Even in childhood, in those first uncertain years of youth, such bonds can shape a person's fate. Two boys walking the same halls, standing beneath the shadow of the same throne, fathered by the same man, and yet in their veins ran the story of rival rivers. One carried a colder, more calculating, more inward kind of menace. The other bore a hatred more open, more brutal, hard as steel. Perhaps, in those years, no one could fully know how often those two names would one day be spoken in the same breath. But the shadows seemed to recognize one another even then. Some enmities do not begin with an open insult. Some wade in the blood long before a man is old enough to lift a sword. And among all those dangerous stars, the presence of Shiera Seastar carried a weight of its own. To speak of her beauty alone would never have been enough, for the court was never lacking in beautiful women. Shiera's power was something different. Wherever her gaze fell, it seemed to leave behind not only desire, but unease as well. Among the king's bastard children, she stood as neither a purely political figure nor merely an ornament of the court. She was more like a star that drew every eye, yet yielded herself fully to no one's understanding. She was radiant, yes, but there was more distance than warmth in that radiance. When her name was spoken, it was as if the very air in the room shifted. That is why Shiera's place in Brynden's early world matters as well. This was not yet a bond to be told in the full weight of love, but something subtler, the meaning two remarkable figures lent one another beneath the same ill-fated family sky. Brynden's pale, marked, and unsettling presence breathed within the same dynasty as Shiera's brilliant, alluring, dangerous radiance, one like the eye of night, the other like a distant star. and both of them were far more than stray fragments of Aegon's blood. They were already becoming the kind of names around which stories would one day gather. But all of these uneasy possibilities, all of these half-shadowed children, all of these silent dangers, might still have remained nothing more than the inward tensions of the court. Had a king died with more restraint, had a dynasty been less arrogant, perhaps it would all have remained a matter of gossip and private rivalry. But Aegon the Fourth left his final poison behind as he rose from the throne for the last time. On his deathbed, he blurred the line of legitimacy with his own hand and legitimized his bastard children. In doing so, he did not merely acknowledge his sons and daughters. He formally placed the sparks that would one day set the realm ablaze inside the body of the state itself. This was not the belated tenderness of a father, nor was it merely the last whim of a king. It was like a blade, careless or deliberate, driven into the balance of a dynasty. Until that moment, bastard birth, no matter how powerful or remarkable the child, was still enclosed by an invisible wall. Aegon tore that wall down. In an instant, Daemon was no longer simply an extraordinary bastard, but a figure around whom lawful claims could be spoken. Aegor was no longer only a hard and dangerous son of the king, but part of a far greater reckoning. Brynden was no longer merely a bastard prince with a marked face and an unsettling gaze. He had become a name that could carry real weight in the future of the dynasty. Shiera and the others, in much the same way, began to pass out of rumor and into political reality. It was then that the air itself began to change. What had once been only a whisper had now become a possibility. What had once been merely a possibility had begun to draw near to fate itself. For every bastard who was legitimized became more than a name. Each became a claim, a banner, a side, and the fact that those sides had not yet fully declared themselves did nothing to lessen the danger. If anything, it deepened it, for the unseen war is often more frightening than the war that has already begun. This was Aegon's final gift, not titles for his children, but unrest for the realm. He did not strengthen the dynasty. He rubbed uncertainty into its veins. He did not multiply loyalty to the throne. He gave rise to new reckonings written in blood. It was beneath that darkened horizon that Brynden Rivers passed through childhood and into his first years of youth. The boy who had been marked since birth was no longer merely one of the court's strange offspring. The world into which he had been born had changed shape around him. The great bastards were no longer only the living reminders of the king's sins. They had become forces capable of bending the future of the realm itself. Blood was no longer a hidden shame. It had become an open political weapon. The golden radiance of the court may still have remained in place, but the stones beneath it had shifted in silence. No sword had yet been drawn. No side had yet been fully born in its true name, but the air around the throne had been stained too deeply ever to return to its former innocence. So even before the war began, before the banners split apart, before a brother's blood touched the earth, the game board had already been set. A king was dead, but what he left behind was not merely children. He left behind a fractured destiny, a marked son, a radiant son, an angry son, a daughter bright as a star. None of them now stood at the edge of the dynasty, but deep within its heart, the bloodline had been blurred, the shadow of the throne had grown heavier, and the future, before anyone had even named it, had quietly become dangerous. When Aegon the Fourth died, he left behind more than his crown. He left behind something far more perilous: uncertainty. That decision on his deathbed, that final decree by which he legitimized his bastards, may not have seemed to shake the walls of the court. The Iron Throne still stood where it always had. Seals were still pressed into wax. Lords still bent the knee. Ravens still flew from castle to castle. But the more familiar the outer shape of order remained, the more deeply its inner substance had changed. For Aegon's illegitimate children were no longer merely the product of rumor, jealousy, and bedchamber intrigue. They had become political beings, names that could give rise to claims, gather banners, and draw oaths. The private sins of a king had, in an instant, become the public fate of a realm. The clearest mark of this new atmosphere was not noise, but silence, the careful silence that comes before open defiance. In the courts, words were chosen more slowly. In the halls, glances lingered longer. Friendships were formed with greater caution, because everyone now understood the same truth. Every legitimized bastard was not merely a person, but a possibility. And the most dangerous possibilities were often the ones that looked most beautiful at first glance. The old order still stood. Daeron Targaryen, now King Daeron II, had taken the throne after his father. The law was on his side. The line of blood was on his side. The language of the throne, the language of the seal, the language of the state, all spoke his name. But in Westeros, law and desire do not always point to the same man, and it was here that the poison Aegon left behind began to show its strength, for legitimacy was no longer merely a right. It had become a matter of dispute. It was into this altered world that Brynden Rivers stepped. He was no longer merely a strange king's son, marked from birth. He had become a figure expected to choose a side and to be remembered by the side he chose. And the choice before him was not a simple matter of preferring one brother over another. For standing opposite him was Daemon Blackfyre, dazzling, powerful, a man who seemed as though he had been born for war, the kind of figure many lords would instinctively wish to follow. When Daemon stood in a throne room, he looked not like the face of legitimacy, but like the face of rule itself. Some men are persuaded by law, others are persuaded by bearing, beauty, strength, and the sword. Daemon possessed all of these. He drew his supporters not only with words, but with his very presence. But Brynden did not stand beside Daemon. His choice took shape elsewhere, along a colder, harsher, heavier line. He chose Daeron. For Brynden Rivers, the question was never simply which brother was stronger, more admired, or easier to love. The true question was which side represented order, and which side carried the continuity of the realm. Daemon may have been radiant, but Daeron was the line itself, the chain itself, the continuity itself. Around Daemon there was glory. Around Daeron there was law. One might wear the crown of desire, the other bore the right to the crown. That is why Brynden's choice ran deeper than personal affection. He placed himself not beside personal charisma, but beside the idea of the state. It was not a warm choice, perhaps, nor was it a poetic one, but it was a grave one. For even in those years, Brynden seemed already to understand that beauty can often tear a kingdom apart, while power, unmoored from law, can produce nothing in the end but blood. To stand with Daeron II did not mean despising Daemon. On the contrary, it meant recognizing just how dangerous Daemon truly was. For some men are rejected not because they are weak, but because they appear too strong. Around Daemon clung the pull of old chivalric dreams, of battlefield nobility, of the great body, the great sword, the great destiny. Many a lord who looked upon him might be tempted to turn the question of who had the rightful claim to the throne into the question of who looked more like a king. And that was precisely the kind of drift Brynden despised. When a realm surrenders itself to the spell of appearances, laws begin to melt away. Brynden understood that, which is why standing with Daeron was not merely a defense of the man who wore the crown. It was a defense of the crown itself, of the very idea of order. In time, that choice ceased to be a matter of personal loyalty and became a dividing line widening within the dynasty itself. As the distance between the great bastards and the legitimate royal line grew, the language of brotherhood began to weaken as well. They were the children of the same father, yes, but they were no longer the children of the same future. Daemon was gathering admiration around him. His name was being spoken more loudly, his fame was spreading farther, and with every lord who joined his cause, it became more visible that he was not merely a man, but an alternative crown. Daemon's power did not rest in war alone, it rested in symbol. To many, he seemed like the one who might restore a kind of nobility the Iron Throne had lost. Brynden, meanwhile, was moving along an altogether different line. He did not gather love around himself, but respect and unease. Those who loved Daemon looked on him with admiration. Those who knew Brynden more often found themselves wondering what he could see, for he was doing what dazzling men so rarely do. He was waiting, watching, measuring, and so the fracture within the family became not only political, but symbolic. On one side stood light, steel, beauty, and attraction. On the other stood order, intellect, patience, and shadow. The brothers born of the same blood no longer seemed like parts of a single dynasty, but like heralds of two destinies that could not exist together. Blood itself was ceasing to be a bond. It was becoming the substance of a deeper tragedy. The hardest, sharpest, most personal face of that fracture revealed itself in Aegon Rivers. The man who would bear the name Bittersteel rose before Brynden not merely as a rival, but as the most opposite form he could possibly take. Where Brynden was cold, Aegon was fiery. Where Brynden was patient, Aegon was impulsive. Where Brynden was a man who searched concealed and calculated with his eyes, Aegon was open, hard, direct, and wounding. And this opposition was no accident. The tension between them did not come only from two legitimized bastards moving within the same field of power. Deep in their blood, the 1,000-year enmity between Blackwood and Bracken had come alive once more. As the dynasty split apart, the personal and the political began to fuse into one. Brynden's turn toward Daeron and Aegor's toward Daemon made the hatred between the two men all but inevitable. For the question was no longer merely who seemed stronger, more beloved, or more worthy in the eyes of others. The question had become what shape the kingdom itself would take. One side defended law. The other believed that charisma and strength could give rise to a king who felt more real, more deserving, and once the ancient hatred of Blackwood and Bracken entered that divide, the enmity could no longer remain something abstract. It found a face, a voice, and a target. That is why the tension between Brynden and Bittersteel did not become some side effect of the war that would one day come. It became one of its very centers. It was under that pressure that Brynden Rivers took on his clearest adult shape. He was no radiant hero of the battlefield like Daemon. Men did not look at him and see the knight of some ancient song, nor was he, like Aegon, a man of blunt fury and hard, open anger. There was something else in Brynden, distance, discipline, and that unsettling attentiveness that never let others rest easy. Some men command a room through speech, some through the sound of their swords. Brynden, more often than not, gave the impression of being the most dangerous man in the room, even when he seemed to be doing nothing at all. Because he was gathering the details others forgot. He was becoming one of those rare men who could sense what people were hiding in their silences, what they were trying not to look at, and which loyalties were true and which were only borrowed. Men like that rarely find much place in songs of chivalry, and yet kingdoms often endure on their shoulders or break because of them. Brynden's power lay in the fact that it was not showy. He cared less for applause in the yard than for the decision made behind a closed door. He noticed not only what a lord said at the table, but whom he looked at before he said it. He could read the silent order hidden behind the noisy face of a kingdom. That was what made him unsettling, for more often than hatred, what people fear is the feeling of being seen. Even before he had fully risen to the summit of power, Brynden Rivers already gave those around him that feeling, that they had been seen. Meanwhile, the realm itself was growing weary of waiting. As the pull surrounding Daemon Blackfyre deepened with each passing year, the faces of the crown's loyal lords grew harder as well. Even when support was not openly declared, everything was beginning to speak for itself. Who sat beside whom at feasts? Who was invited to which weddings? Which names were spoken softly within which halls? In the court chambers, the language of order was still being spoken, but in the corridors another language was beginning to rise, the language of possibility. Men no longer thought only of who the king was. They had begun to wonder who they might one day wish to see as king. And in that space, in that dark interval between legitimacy and desire, a kind of mist began to spread over Westeros. Daemon's support was never made up of personal admiration alone. Around him, a desire for correction was gathering. There were those who believed that the dynasty Aegon had corrupted might, in Daemon's hands, become bright again, more warlike, more fitting, more worthy of the throne. Daeron II, by contrast, embodied an altogether different vision of kingship. Compromise, governance, lawful continuity, and a political order built through marriage, statecraft, and stability. In time, the difference between those two men became the difference between two rival dreams of what a kingdom should be. Those who looked to Daemon saw the poetry of power. Those who looked to Daeron saw the burden of power. And it was here that Brynden's terrible clarity revealed itself most fully. He understood why men loved Daemon, and still he remained beside Daeron, because sometimes the heaviest loyalty is the loyalty given to the thing that is harder to love. As the realm moved closer to open war, Brynden's role began to change as well. He was no longer merely a bastard prince, standing beside the king. He was becoming something far more formidable, an instrument of the crown, a mind in its service and a sword in its hand. But his sword was nothing like Daemon's. Daemon's way of war was the kind that could lead men gladly into death behind him, open, exalted, almost epic in its force. Brynden's martial nature followed an entirely different logic. He understood not the poetry of war, but its structure. Distance, timing, discipline, and precision suited his nature far better, and that identity took on flesh and form in the men who gathered around him. The Raven's Teeth. To see the Raven's Teeth merely as a band of loyal soldiers would be to miss their true meaning. They were Brynden Rivers, made visible on the battlefield, longbowmen, ordered, disciplined, killing from a distance, striking their mark not through passion, but through command. These archers who gathered around Brynden revealed plainly the kind of war leader he was. He was not a man of romantic chivalry, charging forward with his chest bared to the enemy. He was the kind who understood that the deadliest moment in war is often hidden at a distance. The very existence of the raven's teeth also made clear that he was never meant to be remembered only through whispers and court intrigue. When needed, Brynden would take the field, direct armies, and deal out death, but not by blazing like other men. He would do it by imposing order, choosing the target, and leaving no room for error. That made him all the more frightening. For Westeros has no shortage of dangerous men, but far fewer who can both think and fight. Most trust too much in the sword, or lean too heavily on the mind. Brynden moved along a line that never separated the two. The bond he forged with the raven's teeth was shaped less by any hunger for personal glory than by function and loyalty. These men did not stand around him to build a legend. They were there to finish a task, and that laid bare Brynden's understanding of war in its starkest form. Precise, cold, controlled, and lethal. And all the while, the world around Daemon was tightening in ways that could no longer be undone. His name began to be spoken not only with admiration, but with expectation. Lords now walked the line between silent sympathy and open commitment. The fracture, born within a single dynasty, had spread across the whole realm. Castles, families, friendships, marriages, oaths, all of them were beginning to take on new meaning beneath the shadow of the reckoning to come. Not everyone could see everything, but everyone could feel that something was drawing near. The long tension between law and desire was no longer a matter of philosophy. It was moving toward something harsher, toward spears, banners, and graves. Brynden's choice could no longer be taken back, nor could Bittersteel's. Daemon was no longer merely a legitimized son of the king. He had become another center of gravity entirely, a figure with his own pull, his own web of loyalties, his own possibility of kingship. Daeron's side, meanwhile, was growing harder, more watchful, more defensive, and at the same time more deadly. And it was here that Brynden became an indispensable weapon of the crown. He was not the king's most beloved face. He was not its most poetic symbol, but he was becoming one of its most dangerous instruments. Because kingdoms, when they are fighting to survive, often have greater need of cold and lucid men than of radiant heroes, and so they came to the threshold of civil war. The great field had not yet opened. Fate had not yet been fully hammered into iron and blood in the span of a single day of battle. But no one was truly capable of turning back anymore. The struggle between loyalty to the throne and the dream of a brighter crown had become all but inevitable. Brotherhood had split apart. The dynasty had divided into two rival versions of truth. Ancient hatreds had passed beneath new banners, and Brynden Rivers had become something far greater than the ill-omened mark written on his face at birth. Within the coming storm, he had taken his place at last, a force that had turned its coldness into purpose and sharpened itself for the sake of the crown. The board was no longer merely set. The pieces were moving. The realm was dividing beneath two rival forces of attraction. Daemon was becoming the banner of a dream, of desire itself, while Bittersteel hardened into the iron will behind him. And on the other side, Brynden Rivers was coming to embody not the golden splendor of the Iron Throne, but its dark resolve to endure and defend itself. The war had not yet begun, but its shadow had already fallen across the realm. And within that shadow, Bloodraven was no longer merely a name. He was a power drawing near. At last, the long silence ended. Whispers became banners. Caution became marching men. The fracture within the family was no longer just a chill felt at feasts and behind courtly smiles. The 7 kingdoms had entered the disaster they had long felt approaching. Men who had once been sons of the same father now stood in ranks against one another. The hesitations of lords had turned into spears, the admiration of knights into sworn oaths, and ancient hatreds into open war. This was no longer a question of succession to be managed within palace walls. It had become a reckoning that would decide which bloodline would endure, which vision of kingship would prevail, and whether the crown would draw its strength from law or from devotion. The realm was being forced to confront a wound born from within itself. On one side stood Daemon Blackfyre, with his beauty, his prowess in war, his open nobility, and that tragic splendor that seized the eye. On the other stood King Daeron's line, less dazzling, heavier, yet more lawful. The line that represented order, legitimacy, and the continuity of the dynasty. These 2 truths could no longer exist side by side. Men were about to learn in blood the difference between loving a king and accepting one. And when that moment came, Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven, stepped out of the shadows and took on the solid, mortal shape of war. What set Brynden apart in that war was that he possessed none of the radiant heroism that blazed around Daemon. He was not the kind of man to sweep others after him in a rush of fervor. The men who gathered around him were rarely gathered for glory. They gathered for results. On the battlefield, Daemon looked like a hero from the songs of an older age. Great, noble, open, bright enough to make men want to follow him. Bloodraven was a different kind of danger. His power lay in the fact that it did not glitter. He used silence more readily than noise. More than the open call to battle, he understood position, timing, distance, and opportunity. In war, as in court, he was a man not of emotion, but of measure. For Brynden Rivers was not a man who merely wished to be brave in war. He was one of those rare men who truly understood what war was. He knew that the soul of an army is held together not by scattered courage, but by discipline, and that a battlefield is more often won by death arriving at the right moment than by the glitter of swords. Here, his coldness was not a flaw, but a method. Some commanders drive their men forward with passion, some with glory, some with madness. Bloodraven sought certainty. The threat he carried in war settled inside a man like the feeling of suffocation, because he was one of those men who never lost himself, not even when he struck. The purest extension of that quality was the raven's teeth. They did not stand around Brynden like some ordinary guard. Both in the darkness their name carried, and in the role they played in war, they reflected Bloodraven's very nature. Longbowmen, bound to command, trained in the discipline of distance, men who struck their targets not with fervor, but with practiced hardness. The raven's teeth were the visible form of his will upon the battlefield. If the strength around Daemon took shape in the neighing of horses, the flash of swords, and the open valor of the field, then Bloodraven's strength gathered itself in the tight ranks of the raven's teeth, in their hands waiting with patience, in their bows held still until the right moment came. Their way of war carried the spirit of their master as well. In place of the blind honor of man-to-man collision, there was the order of controlled death. They moved not like separate men, but like a single will. On the battlefield, the drawing of their bows felt as natural and just as unnerving as the turning of a flock of birds. They did not merely strike an enemy, they chose him. And that in itself proved why Bloodraven was never merely a creature of courtly games. In war, too, he could speak in his own language, but his language was not the language of steel so much as of air, speed, precision, and patience. And all of that tension, all of that division, all of the desire and fear gathered over the years, finally found its fate at Redgrass Field. It was not merely a battlefield. It was as though all the broken oaths of the Seven Kingdoms, all the arguments over bastard legitimacy, all the hatreds between brothers, all the twisted forms of love had come together in that one place. It felt as if the ground was covered not in dew, but in expectation. Even as the banners moved in the wind, the air carried not just the weight of a single day, but of many years. The name Redgrass Field would later become bound to blood, betrayal, and turning point. But even before the swords had fully spoken, there was already a feeling there that something was nearing its end. The air of that day held not only fate, but mourning. Every man knew what he was fighting for. Yet no one could truly deny that this war would leave no one clean. Those who fought for the throne were not battling only for the right to rule. They were fighting for the truth of their own story, and that made the war darker still. For when men die only for land, some hope of settlement may remain behind them. But when they die for the truth they believe to be their very own, mercy begins to narrow. That was the kind of mourning Redgrass Field bore, and at the heart of that day stood Daemon Blackfyre in all his weight and presence. To diminish him as nothing more than a rebel would require a failure to understand all the men who rode beneath his cause. For those who followed, Daemon had not gathered around a mere usurper. In him, they saw a vision of power made more open, more warlike, more magnificent. There was poetry in Daemon's kingship. He was one of those men, tall, strong, and graceful, the sort for whom a sword seemed natural in the hand. Some men wear a crown, others look as though the crown was always meant to be theirs. Daemon belonged to the second kind. That is why his presence was not only political, but emotional as well. But that was also what made Daemon tragic, for he was not the hollow bearer of some false grandeur. He truly did seem great. He truly was the kind of man people wanted to believe in. His fall would not be merely the defeat of a rival. It would be the shattering of many men's chosen faith, their admiration, their vision of the ideal king. That is why Redgrass Field was not only a battlefield. It was the place where a legend was put to death. Brynden Rivers entered that same scene under a very different light, where Daemon drew all eyes to himself. Bloodraven directed where those eyes would turn. Daemon seemed like the heart of the field. Brynden was its nerve. One was the face of war, the other its mind. One called men toward the honor of the sword, the other toward the inevitability of the outcome. That is why Bloodraven's role in this moment carries such moral weight as well. He was not too blind to see Daemon's greatness. He saw it, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, and still, he judged that Daemon had to be stopped. The justice of Bloodraven's side did not come from being more lovable. It came from being the less ruinous answer to a conflict that could no longer be solved. It was here that the darkest knot of the war was tied, when Daemon Blackfyre and his sons passed into the deadly range of the raven's teeth. More than a few lives were brought to an end. A whole shape of possibility collapsed with them. When the arrows were loosed, they carried more than iron and feather. They carried the reason of the state, fear, necessity, and merciless resolve. The fall of Daemon and his sons became the deepest wound of Redgrass Field, for this moment decided more than the military outcome of the battle. Here, the death of a father and his sons became the moral stain upon the entire conflict. The crown may have been saved in that instant, but it could never recover its innocence. Victory may have been won there, but it could not remain clean. The manner of that killing darkened Bloodraven's name forever. There was no poetry here of an open duel between knights, face to face upon the field. No gleam of some singular reckoning declared in heroic terms. There was distance, calculation, decision, and the shadow left behind by that decision summoned whispers of kinslaying, the bitter taste of necessity, and the ugly truth of how far a state may go when it moves to preserve itself. For Bloodraven, this was not merely a triumph won in the name of the crown. It was the moment when his name could never again be spoken as only that of a marked bastard prince. And yet that moment in the war was not confined only to the invisible line of death stretched between Bloodraven and Daemon, for Redgrass Field also gave flesh to the older, barer, more personal hatred between Bloodraven and Bittersteel. For Aegon Rivers, Daemon's cause was never merely a political choice. He had poured into this war his vision of the king he believed in, his own fury, and the full weight of his pride. Within Bittersteel, the Blackfyre cause and his hatred of Brynden had become impossible to separate. He was no longer simply a commander on the other side. He seemed to walk as the living shape of the ancient Blackwood-Bracken feud, of bastard pride, of a hatred that had long since overflowed the boundaries of brotherhood. For that reason, the clash between the two men cannot be treated as some minor scene at the edge of the war. Whether their steel met in the heart of Redgrass or at its fringes matters less than the meaning carried by that encounter. Brynden and Aegon had been forming themselves as opposites long before the war ever began. Now that opposition had taken on flesh and blood, Bittersteel's rage was open, searing, almost primal in its force. He was the kind of man who stepped before Bloodraven without concealing his hatred. Brynden, as ever, stood with a colder, quieter, deadlier kind of control. But in this personal knot within the war, even control did not come without cost. Bittersteel's steel reached Brynden and took one of his eyes. That wound was not merely flesh torn open. It was the seal the war left upon Brynden's face. A man already marked from birth had now been marked again. By losing one eye, he carried for the rest of his life the proof that this civil war had torn something from him as well. In that way, Redgrass Field became legible upon his body. He would now be remembered not only for the crimson birthmark, but for his diminished gaze. The loss was symbolic because Brynden was said, all his life, to see what others missed, to sense what others could not, to notice what escaped the eyes of other men. And now that great war had taken a physical piece of his sight. It was as though the claim of defending the realm had exacted from him the price of seeing. Bittersteel's side did not win its final victory that day, yet Aegon did not shatter and vanish like a broken man. His was the kind of fury that only hardened after Daemon's fall, and that too was one of the curses of Redgrass. While war may kill one man, it can make another eternal. Bittersteel did not leave that day merely as a defeated commander. He left as an enemy whose hatred had been sharpened into something even purer. The reckoning between him and Bloodraven did not end there. On the contrary, it deepened into something more personal, more enduring, and far more impossible to turn back from. And yet, for all those costs, the outcome of the war was unmistakable. With Daemon's fall, the loyalists of the crown carried the field. The rebellion was broken. The king's line remained standing. The Iron Throne, at least for that moment, was spared from being torn apart. But the victory brought no peace, for what had been preserved was the continuity of order, while what had been lost was the belief that order itself could remain innocent. Redgrass Field had saved the realm, but stained its soul in the saving. There was victory, yes, but victory tasted of metal. It carried grief within it. It carried the blood of brothers. For Bloodraven, that truth weighed even more heavily. He was not merely a man who watched the war unfold, nor one who passed judgment on its outcome afterward. He was one of the hands that determined it. He had stood on the rightful side for the sake of the crown, but the methods of the rightful side do not always leave a man untouched. From that moment on, Brynden Rivers would be, to many, a loyal servant who had saved the kingdom. But to many others, he would be the dark figure who felled Daemon and his sons from afar, sealing victory in a way that was necessary, yet merciless. When men spoke his name after that, they would no longer speak only of loyalty. Fear would cling to it as well, and revulsion, and a kind of grim admiration. After Redgrass Field, the 7 kingdoms went on living. Castles still stood, ravens still flew, laws were still written. But the wound opened that day was not the kind to close easily. The hopes that had gathered around Daemon were left in the earth, yet the longing that had given them life did not die with him. So long as men like Bittersteel still lived, that longing would endure, fused now with hatred. The king's side had won, but the victory itself became the seed of new enmities. For some victories carry the unrest of the future within them. And for Brynden Rivers, it was here that the true transformation was completed. He was no longer merely Aegon's marked son, Melissa Blackwood's strange-eyed child, the unsettling prince of the court. After Redgrass, his name took on a harsher weight. Bloodraven no longer sounded like a nickname born only from a birthmark. The name had merged with the reputation he won in war, with the arrows that fell into the heart of the enemy, with the disciplined death of the raven's teeth, with Daemon's fall, and with the wound Bittersteel had carved into him. Bloodraven no longer resembled a man so much as a memory, a fear, a method. After Redgrass Field, Brynden Rivers was no longer merely a man. That day may have won him victory, but it did not win him love. If anything, what trailed behind him as he left that field was not devotion, but unease. Men had seen how far he was willing to go for the crown. The fall of Daemon Blackfyre and his sons, the bloody reckoning with Bittersteel, the fresh wound he bore upon his face, all of it had fused the name Bloodraven not only with the mark of his birth, but with the hardest will of the state itself. To become indispensable to a king is not the same thing as becoming beloved by the realm. Bloodraven embodied that truth better than anyone. After Redgrass, his name sank so deeply into the political life that turned around the Iron Throne that it became difficult to separate him from the crown itself. Men searched for his hand behind every decision. His name was whispered behind every arrest. Even a broken oath in some distant castle was sometimes traced back to his shadow. He was no longer merely a prince in service to the king. He had become something like a reflex, woven into the very nerves of the realm, and so a new atmosphere settled over the realm, the atmosphere of a kingdom living beneath Bloodraven's eye. This was not merely the fear created by armies drawn up on the walls, or executioners pacing through public squares. It was subtler than that, more suffocating, more invisible. From north to south, from the riverlands to the castles of the Reach, ravens flew. Messages were carried, names were noted, and even half-finished conversations could feel as though they were passing from one ear to another, and from there, all the way back to the court. Bloodraven's true power no longer lay only in being a man of war who could wield sword or bow upon the field. His deepest strength was in sensing a threat before it had fully taken shape, in catching the scent of rebellion before a single banner had been raised. People told many things about him. Some said the walls had ears, Some said the ravens were his eyes. Some believed that in every inn, every sept, every lord's hall, there was at least one soul in service to Bloodraven. How much of this was true, and how much was only the exaggeration fear writes for itself, was not easy to tell. But that was precisely the point. It was possibility, more than certainty, that frightened people. A man does not need to see everything with his own eyes. Once everyone believes that he might, half his power is already built. That was the new thing Bloodraven brought to the reign. He was no longer merely a man who answered threats once they appeared. He was hunting for them while they were still only thoughts, glances, and implications. One of the most unforgettable tests of that suffocating atmosphere of state power came at Whitewalls. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion did not, at first glance, present the same open, thunderous vision of civil war that Redgrass Field had. Here, the danger was quieter. It moved through narrower corridors, behind more carefully closed doors, in more measured raised cups. Whitewalls was not merely a castle ringed in stone walls. It felt more like a chamber where a political sickness had been left to gather. From the outside, it might have seemed a place of nightly games, tourney fever, and noble assembly. But inside, something else was growing. The hope that the Blackfyre cause might live again. The darkest thing about the danger at Whitewalls was that it had not yet fully taken shape. Open war, at least, declares itself. It reveals its commanders, marks its sides, and makes plain where it intends to strike. Conspiracy is different. It first poisons the air. It changes the silence inside a room. It infects the way men seated at the same table look at one another. That was what was happening at Whitewalls. A new hope descended from Daemon Blackfyre's blood. A new dream, a new challenge, had begun to create a hidden pull around itself before it had even fully drawn breath. But it was precisely here that Bloodraven's power began. For he was not merely fighting rebellion. He could read the birth pains of rebellion as well. The crushing of that second attempt at Whitewalls revealed Bloodraven's new kind of power in its starkest form. There was none of the epic thunder of a great pitched battle here. Victory arrived instead, like a cold door thrown suddenly open, like a word spoken at the wrong moment, like a siege that left no room to flee. Bloodraven's presence was often felt before he physically arrived. It was as if his hand had already reached into those stone halls, marked the names, weighed the loyalties, counted even the rhythm of men's breathing. When he fell upon Whitewalls, what was truly broken was not only a conspiracy, but the conspirators' faith in their own invisibility. Bloodraven showed them something plainly. I am no longer merely a man who can win a war. I am a man who can smother it before it is born. That is why the suppression of Whitewalls carries less the feeling of a military victory than of suffocation. The rebellion was cut off before it could find the air it needed to breathe. The timing was so exact, the intervention so complete, that the matter ceased to be one of force alone and became a matter of knowledge. And it was here that Bloodraven's most frightening quality stood fully revealed. To march an army against a lord is the old way. To lay siege to a castle is an intelligible reflex of the state. But to crush a rebellion before it has even reached the point of calling itself a rebellion, that is another kind of power entirely. More invisible, more constricting, less heroic, and far more suffocating. After Whitewalls, much of the realm understood that. After Whitewalls, the atmosphere around Brynden Rivers changed more sharply than ever. It was no longer only his enemies who weighed him with care, but his allies as well. For with each new success, he was becoming one of those men who seem a little less human the more effective they become. He was still made of flesh, blood, wounds, and exhaustion, of course, but in political terms, he was slowly ceasing to be a prince and becoming a mechanism. If there was suspicious correspondence somewhere, men assumed it had already reached his knowledge. If a lord had grown too quiet, the question became whether Bloodraven had noticed. In castles, in inns, on the road, at tourney grounds, even at family tables, his name no longer moved like the name of a person, but like a possibility. Bloodraven may already know. Power like that does not feed on fear alone. It feeds on habit as well. In time, the realm grew used to Bloodraven's presence, to his invisible networks, to the hardness of his timing. Even as men tried to hide their secrets, they first found themselves wondering whether he had already heard them. This was not merely political pressure. It was pressure upon the mind. He had become not only a commander of armies, but a governor of hesitation itself, and that made him lonelier still. For the man who is felt to be present in everyone's thoughts is often the one who is never truly present beside anyone. But when old wars, old hatreds, and men like Bittersteel are concerned, nothing is ever truly finished. Aegon Rivers, Bittersteel, remained the hard opposite pole to Bloodraven. No matter how many years passed, the fire of the first Blackfyre rebellion may have burned low. The secret effort at Whitewalls may have been smothered, but the fury burning inside Bittersteel was never the kind that scattered easily, nor the kind that tired. He did not carry Daemon's cause as a mere political calculation. To him, it was personal loyalty, the continuation of hatred between brothers, and the desire to reclaim a world that had been shattered at Redgrass Field. As the years passed, that struggle took on an even stranger shape. The half-brothers of youth no longer seemed like merely two men. They began to look like two separate lines of history. Bittersteel was the fire of exile beyond the borders, open, hard, defiant, hungry to return, a will that turned waiting itself into hatred. Bloodraven, by contrast, was the cold state within, silent, watchful, recording, measuring, waiting for the right moment, trying to choke the enemy before he could ever cross the threshold. The enmity between them never lost its nature as a personal wound, but it also became something larger, the symbol of an endless war between two different futures for the dynasty. That is why the Third Blackfyre Rebellion was not merely the third act of an old dispute. It was the reopening of a wound that had never truly healed. On the surface, the realm may have gone on living, passing into new years, new rulers, new concerns, but the Blackfyre cause was like blood that refused to stay buried. At times it sank beneath the earth, only to rise again through some new crack. For Bloodraven, this return was never just another tiresome matter of state. Each new rebellion hardened his view of the world a little further. Each new attempt deepened his conviction that mercy, in the affairs of a kingdom, could exact too high a price. If rebellion had been born again, then the earlier victory had not been enough. It was no longer enough merely to defeat the enemy. The possibility itself had to be smothered. That was why the Third Blackfyre Rebellion came to feel, in Bloodraven's hands, like a kind of recurring fate, but it possessed none of the romantic grandeur of the First Rebellion. At Redgrass, the poetry of an age had been shattered. Here, that poetry had long since worn away, leaving behind only a blood feud, more tired, more stubborn, and more severe. And yet the danger was not something to be dismissed, for when a cause returns again and again, it reveals less about its military strength than about its emotional endurance. Bloodraven understood that exactly, and so his response was never that of a weary defense. On the contrary, with each return he moved according to a harsher logic: crush it more quickly, more tightly, more early than before. By then, he was becoming less a commander who put down rebellions than a guardian of the state who could no longer tolerate even the possibility of rebellion. The outcome of the Third Blackfyre Rebellion only confirmed that harsher logic. Once again, the throne remained standing. Once again, the royal line was preserved. And Bittersteel, in yet another link of this long enmity, at last fell into the hands of the crown. At first glance, that great result might seem like yet another triumph of order. But in Bloodraven's story, none of his victories are ever wholly clean. Even Bittersteel's capture does not feel like a joyful ending. It feels more like a darker station in a struggle that had been grinding on for far too long. By then, these conflicts had moved far beyond the bonds of brotherhood or arguments over legitimacy. The crown had been saved again. But at what cost? That question had begun to seep into every story told about Bloodraven. He may once more have stood on the rightful side. He may once more have preserved the order of the realm. But the way he preserved that order was drawing him farther and farther from the ordinary moral world of ordinary men. For those who grow accustomed to seeing through the eyes of the state can, in time, begin to regard human faces as details. Bloodraven was walking that line. He was still necessary, still effective, still indispensable. But he was also becoming more frightening still. A man who did not allow a possibility to live, but smothered it, who crushed a movement before it could gather strength, who heard the answering voice before it had even begun to speak. And more, he seemed to be doing this not for one king alone, but for the very institution of the crown itself. Here, the true historical transformation comes into view. Kings changed. The reign of Daeron II passed. Aerys I came after him, and in that quiet rule turned toward books, signs, and other worlds. Bloodraven became even more central as the practical and dark-willed force of the state. Then time placed yet another crown upon another head. Faces changed, titles changed, the voices within the court changed. But Bloodraven remained. This was not mere bureaucratic continuity. It was something deeper. A man ceasing to be only the servant of a single ruler and becoming woven into the very machinery of governance itself. One king might die, another might rise. The nature of threats might change, yet Bloodraven's function remained the same. See, wait, suppress. And so, the line between Brynden Rivers himself and the machinery of the state began to grow thin. He was no longer merely a noble bastard, a war hero, or a capable counselor. He had begun to seem like the realm's instinct for self-preservation made flesh. That is why his importance was not only political, but symbolic as well. Kings were temporary. Bloodraven carried the feeling of permanence. And that made him not only powerful, but dangerous. For when a man begins to seem more enduring than the ruler he serves, he is no longer simply serving power. He is beginning to think in power's own language. And within all of this, what grew heaviest was the burden of necessity. Bloodraven was still useful, still swift, still striking at the right moment. He still hated hesitation, still recognized threats by name, still caught the scent of conspiracy before it fully formed. For the kingdom, a man like that was beyond price. But for a man to be continually necessary does not mean he has escaped the cost. Sometimes the opposite is true. Those who are needed without cease are often the ones most deeply transformed. And around Bloodraven, that transformation could now be felt plainly. It was as if he no longer lived within the same time as ordinary men. Friendship, grief, family, simple loyalties, these things were slipping further and further into the background for him. He was drifting out of the emotional world of a prince and toward the reflexes of an instrument of state. That is why, when we look at his story, it is not enough merely to count his successes. What matters more is what each success took from him. Redgrass had darkened him. Whitewalls had made him suffocating. The third rebellion had bound him even more tightly to a logic of necessity that was impatient, preventive, and cold. Bloodraven was no longer a man who moved only when rebellion broke into the open. He had become a man who lived because rebellion might break into the open. And to live like that is to drift away from both the people and the blood you came from. And yet his indispensability to the crown did not change. Perhaps that is where his greatest tragedy truly lies, for kingdoms do not easily release the dark men who keep them standing. Bloodraven was feared, yes. Whispers gathered around his name, yes. Men did not find his methods clean, and at times they saw him less as a man than as some grim necessity, and still they needed him. They needed him so the throne would remain standing, so the borders would remain quiet, so old blood would not rise again, so poison chambers like Whitewalls would never find the air to breathe, so enemies, like bitter steel, would never again enter the realm in full force. Bloodraven was necessary, and so, by the end of this period, Brynden Rivers stood at the height of dark state power. He was still formidable, still terrifying, still central to everything. His name no longer belonged merely to a prince or a man of war. It had become the name of surveillance, of suppression, of sensing danger before it appeared, and of suffocating it at the proper moment. In his era, rebellion was not merely defeated, it was denied the air to breathe. The kingdom remained standing beneath his shadow, yet it felt the weight of that same shadow upon it. In this age, Bloodraven had become the crown's darkest guardian, indispensable, unsettling, effective, and with every passing year, less human. And for that very reason, even before he had fallen, he had already begun to carry the shape of a fall within himself. When King Aegon died, the kingdom suffered more than the loss of a ruler. It was as if the central weight had suddenly been pulled away, and the stone arches that had stood under strain for so many years had begun to tremble from within. When the throne stands empty, it is not only the court that falls silent. For a moment, the whole realm seems to hold its breath. And when that realm is one where long-suppressed claims still linger, where the wounds of dynasty have never truly been forgotten, and where the name Blackfyre still lies warm beneath the soil, that emptiness becomes all the more dangerous. With Maekar's death, Westeros found itself without a center once again. Old fears returned, old names began to gather weight once more, and in the midst of all that fragility, Bloodraven still stood where he had long stood before, older now, wounded, hated, yet still powerful. And yet there was a change in the air. This time, the matter did not seem as manageable as a conspiracy to be suffocated, like Whitewalls, or a spark of rebellion returning from exile. The emptiness left by Maekar was not merely a threat. It was a moment in which the order itself was being questioned. For when a king dies, the state does not merely search for a new head. It must also decide who has the right to rule, who will be judged worthy to rule, which past must be forgotten, and which past must be summoned back into the light. Bloodraven was still central in such an hour, yes, but the center itself was becoming something larger than a knot he could untangle. through suppression alone. And so the Great Council was called. From the outside, it might have seemed a noble mechanism by which the dynasty gathered its reason, upheld the law, and secured the continuity of order. But the true air of that hall was heavier than that. It was not only genealogies that were being spoken there. Memory was speaking as well. Old wars, old loyalties, old betrayals, old deaths had entered that chamber too. As the lords took their seats, they were measuring not only the future, but one another's pasts. Who had supported whom? Who had stood beneath which banner in which war? In which houses the shadow of Blackfyre blood still lived? Which men had remained silent beneath Bloodraven's eye, and which had clenched their teeth and waited? That is why the Great Council was never merely a dispute over succession. It was the accumulated fear and unspoken anger of many years, given an official frame, and Bloodraven could never be imagined as standing outside that process. He was still one of the most powerful men in the realm. Years of war, intelligence, intrigue, crushed rebellions, and claims driven into exile had gathered around him. Even while men debated the lawful right of one candidate or another, they could not help wondering whether Bloodraven's invisible finger rested somewhere upon the scales. He was not merely a participant. His presence was a pressure in itself, for in rooms where he stood, men were forced to consider not only what they thought, but what they would dare to say aloud. For that very reason, the arrival of Aenys Blackfyre could not feel like the simple appearance of another claimant. What entered that hall, that debate, that critical hour, was not merely a man. It was a bloodline that had never abandoned the hope of return. The name Blackfyre had been broken at Redgrass Field, but it had never been fully buried. So long as men like Bittersteel still drew breath, so long as sons and grandsons remained in exile, everyone knew that name was still waiting for its moment to rise again. Aenys came walking out of that history. His presence carried meaning far beyond an ordinary dynastic claim. Politically, he was dangerous because he could draw the Blackfyre cause back into the realm of legitimate debate. Emotionally, he was dangerous because he could awaken loyalties people believed had long since been buried. Symbolically, he was dangerous because he forced Westeros to ask a question it had never truly answered. When the First War ended, what had really been resolved? Aenys's arrival was, for that reason, a quiet moment charged with electricity. He was not merely a man laying claim to what he believed was his by right. He was placing the unresolved knot of an entire dynastic history back upon the table. And from Bloodraven's point of view, it was a sight far too familiar to be endured, for this was exactly what he had spent years doing, smothering the Blackfyre possibility before it could grow, crushing rebellion before it raised a banner, sealing a crack before it could bring the wall down. But Aenys's presence was no longer a crack. It was the old wound itself returning to flesh. And this time, it came not upon an open battlefield, but cloaked in the forms of law and counsel. Aenys Blackfyre had been granted safe conduct. That was not merely a courtesy. In fragile political hours such as these, it was one of the principles that held order together. A promise, especially in such times, can carry as much weight as a sword. The vow of safe passage is the last narrow bridge that allows a man to walk unafraid through the land of his enemies, and Bloodraven destroyed that bridge. He had Aenys seized, then he had him killed. The decision echoed as one of the darkest, most unforgivable political acts of his life, and yet to read it as random cruelty would still be incomplete, for this act was the logical end of all his methods. At Redgrass, he had killed from afar. At Whitewalls, He had denied conspiracy the air to breathe. For years he had hunted threats before they were fully born. Now he looked even upon a rival who had come under the protection of law and saw only a possibility that might one day grow dangerous. And he cut that possibility off at the root. The path he had walked in the name of protecting the state had, in the end, carried him across the visible moral line the state claimed to uphold. That is why Aenys's death was not merely the execution of a man. It was the naked unveiling of the very form of power Bloodraven had spent his whole life building. Until that moment, many lords, many kings, and many frightened allies had been troubled by his methods, yet still treated him as a necessity whose usefulness outweighed its stain. Dirty, but necessary. Cold, but effective. Terrible, but on our side. Such judgments had been able to live around Bloodraven for many years. But with the killing of Aenys Blackfyre, that defense was shaken openly for the first time. Because there was no battlefield here. No rebellion had yet erupted. There was only a rival who had come under a promise of safety. And Bloodraven shattered that promise at the very heart of politics. The unease, revulsion, and fear that had been gathering for years finally took shape in that single act, so the realm could no longer turn its gaze away. Bloodraven's dark usefulness was no longer merely the complaint of those who stood against him. The order that had used him for years, that had kept the throne standing through him, that had learned to live beneath his shadow, was now forced to see that a boundary had been crossed. The reaction was not some sudden burst of hatred. Most men had not loved him for a very long time. It was the discomfort of many years finally ripening into consequence. Every crushed conspiracy, every vanished name, every whispered fear, every bitter sentence that began with, "But it was necessary," now returned in the blood of Aenys. And the judgment that gathered around Bloodraven felt less like a response to one deed than the verdict passed upon an entire age. And it was at this moment that the reign of Aegon the Fifth began. The coming of a new king was not merely a change of crowns. It was a change in the moral atmosphere of the court itself. Aeg was no longer a child. He had grown beside Dunk, had seen the lives of ordinary people not from a distance but up close, and had learned to view both the splendor and the failings of the dynasty through different eyes. When he looked at Bloodraven, it was impossible for him to see only a loyal servant of the state. Behind him stood Redgrass, Whitewalls, the long web of fear woven over the years, and now the killing of Aenys Blackfyre under safe conduct. Aegon the Fifth was not blind to how dangerous, how historic, how indispensable a figure Bloodraven had been. Perhaps that was precisely why he could not leave him where he stood. For some men are removed from court, not because they have grown weak, but because they have become too decisive, too defining, to remain within it. Bloodraven does not diminish here. His fall is not the fall of a broken man. On the contrary, only a man of such magnitude could make his severing from the south feel this heavy. He was still a figure of historic weight. Even now, when his name was spoken, old memories stirred across the faces of lords. When he entered a room, the silence within it ceased to be an ordinary silence, and yet his age in the south had come to an end. The rule of Aegon the Fifth drew the final line beneath Bloodraven's long life at the center of power. After all those years, the man who had preserved the order of the realm was now being cast out from within that very order. And it is here that the tragedy finds its truest form. The man of methods that kept the kingdom standing must, in the end, be driven out so that the kingdom may go on living. His arrest, his trial, and his condemnation must be understood not through melodrama, but through weight. Even in chains, Bloodraven does not become small. Even brought before judgment, he does not turn into an ordinary criminal. His tragedy is not that he had lost his power, but that his power had grown dark in a way that could no longer be accepted. The man who had spent years watching every crack in the realm was now brought before the inescapable reckoning in his own life. Judgment fell on him not because he was weak, but because, for too long, he had become a form of power that wore away the human face of the state. His presence had become impossible to sustain within the political life of the South. That is why the sentence laid upon him was not a simple administrative decision, but a historical severing. Instead of death, he was commanded to take the black. In that way, Bloodraven was neither forgiven nor destroyed in any ordinary sense. What he was given was, in one way, the right to go on living, but within an entirely different world. As the courts of the South were taken from him, along with their council chambers, sealed letters, lords' tables, and hidden networks, he was not being wholly abandoned either. For the Night's Watch is one of the few places in Westeros that is both exile and necessity. The man sent there is sometimes meant to be forgotten, and sometimes meant to be used in another form. For Bloodraven, the sentence carried the very doubleness that had always marked his life, both fall and continuation, both severance and survival. One of the most unforgettable images in his fall is Dark Sister. That Valyrian steel blade, one of the old war memories of House Targaryen, passed from hand to hand, yet always kept beneath the shadow of the dynasty. That slender and deadly sword was now going north with Bloodraven. There is no need to overstate the meaning of the blade, for its true power lies in its quiet symbolism. The strange man who had been cast out from the courts of the South, who had lived for years as the crown's darkest defender, was now carrying away with him a fragment of the dynasty's ancient steel. It was as if one of the South's last Targaryen shadows, leaving behind an age of fear-soaked politics, took with him not only his scars, but the cold metallic memory of the dynasty itself. This is one of the deepest farewells of Bloodraven's life. He was no longer the man of council chambers, no longer the nightmare of southern lords, no longer the indispensable shadow behind kings. And yet, none of those things had fully fallen away from him. For when a man goes into exile, he does not leave his past behind at the gate. And so, as Bloodraven turned his back on the South, he left behind not only his titles, but the full weight of an age. The arrows of Redgrass, the airless halls of Whitewalls, the smothered rebellions, the unending shadow of Blackfyre, the blood of Aenys, the order built through fear, all of it still clung to him like an unseen cloak. And then his life in the South truly fell behind him. It was not death, nor was it yet the final transformation, but it was the closing of an identity, the prince of the court, the one-eyed archer of Redgrass, the shadow behind kings, the master of secrets, the man who had become fear in the machinery of the state. All of those faces began to recede behind him on the long road to the wall. Yet they were not being erased. They simply would no longer go on living in the same world. At this point, Bloodraven is still a great man, still dangerous, still not the kind of figure who could ever disappear among the ordinary men of history. But he no longer belongs to the South. Courts, crowns, councils, and all the reckonings of the southern kingdoms have been cut away from him. That is why his journey north feels less like a journey than the striking out of an entire life. His old life has ended. His new one has not yet begun. Here he stands between two worlds. Behind him, he leaves the heavy gold of courts, broken oaths, slain rivals, and an order preserved through fear. Before him lies a different kind of hardness, but he has not yet entered it. In this final southern scene, Bloodraven is still the man we know, marked, wounded, frightening, cold, a man who has seen much and paid for it. Only now the place of that man is changing, and with the cold weight of Dark Sister at his side, hanging like the last iron memory of the South, Brynden Rivers walks away from one life and toward another. The old world closes behind him. The new world does not yet speak its name. Once the South lay behind him, Brynden Rivers was no mere exile. He was a man pushed out of an age. There had been a time when the whispers in royal halls grew heavier at the mention of his name, when lords measured what he might know before they ever took their seats at table, when rebellions felt his shadow before they were even born. Now his horse was turned toward the north, and the world of stone castles, sealed letters, court chambers, and fragile calculations around the throne had fallen behind him. Ahead, the wall rose up, not like something made by human hands, but like an ancient wound in the world itself, white, silent, merciless. To reach it was not merely to arrive somewhere, it was to be severed from one life beyond recall. The politics of the South stain a man. The cold of the North tests whatever remains. And when he came to the wall, he did not bring only his black cloak and his old renown. He brought the burden of long years with him as well. His lost eye, the mark on his face, the fear gathered around his name, the shadows of Blackfyre, the rebellions he had crushed, the promises given and broken. None of these fell away from him when he dismounted in the yard at Castle Black. The Night's Watch was not made to strip a man clean of his past. If anything, a man's past often grows harsher, barer, and more silent in the cold of the wall. Bloodraven could not seem ordinary here either, for there are some men who change the very air around them wherever they go, and yet the wall did not become a simple continuation of his former life. There was less intrigue there, but the danger was more primal, more honest. In the South, men try to kill one another with words. Here, the cold, hunger, loneliness, and darkness did that work instead. For that reason, Bloodraven's presence within the Night's Watch carried a strange duality. On one hand, he had fallen. He was no longer counted as a prince, nor a hand, nor the realm's invisible ruler. He had taken the black, and black tends to flatten most of the distinctions of the old world. But on the other hand, certain things in his nature became almost more legible there. The Watch was a place that demanded vigilance more than splendor, patience, memory, a familiarity with the night, the ability to sense a distant threat before it drew near. All of these were qualities Bloodraven had always possessed. What had once been a kind of poisonous mastery in the South was becoming something barer, more necessary here. For perhaps the first time, he had entered a world more suited to his true nature. For the wall is not only a prison, it is the line where the kingdom ends and the older world begins. There, titles wear thin, ambition freezes, and a man is measured not only by what he is, but by what he can endure. Bloodraven's old life had passed among silks, letters, spies, councils, and kings. The Watch endured instead through stone towers, faces worn down by the wind, the endless keeping of night, and the slow dwindling of men. In such a place, his former grandeur might have lost all meaning, but his sharpness of attention, his silence, his hard discipline, and his wakefulness did not lose theirs. On the contrary, as the titles of the South were stripped away, the core that remained began to show itself more clearly. That is why his rise within the Night's Watch does not feel like a return to his old southern power. His becoming Lord Commander is not a step back toward the court, but a deeper settling into another truth. To be chosen within the Watch is not the same as rising in a throne room. Here, power means less display and more burden. To become Lord Commander is not to speak before great lords, but to hold together an order that is slowly wearing away. And that is why Bloodraven's ascent to that office carries such a strange sense of rightness. In the South, he had always been slightly too cold, too unsettling, too invisible a force. At the Wall, those same qualities became less like flaws and more like tools. Lord Commander Brynden Rivers bears a different kind of authority from Brynden Rivers, Hand of the King. Here, he no longer governs a dynasty, he guards a line. He no longer watches kings, he watches the emptiness beyond. More than sealed letters, it is tracks in the snow that matter now. More than political loyalties, it is the length of winter and the silence coming from beyond the wall. And yet, anyone who knew him would still feel that these two men were not wholly strangers to one another. For in the South and in the North alike, the core of Bloodraven remained the same: to wait, to watch, to see the hidden links, and never to loosen his grip. Only the thing he was watching had changed. Then the North began to change him. The change did not come all at once. It did not strike like some burst of sorcery, nor was it completed in a single event. It came more like a long winter slowly sinking into a man's bones. The cold was not only in the air, but in time itself. The days began to resemble one another. The nights grew longer, and the concerns of the South seemed with every passing season more distant, smaller, and more foreign. Things that had once carried deadly importance at court grew strangely light here. Which lord had taken offense at whom? Which marriage had broken which alliance? Which king's counselor had slighted which rival? Beneath the shadow of the wall, before that vast white silence, such matters began to shrink. The politics that had shaped Bloodraven's life slowly lost their voice in the North. In their place came an older world. The forests beyond the Wall are not like the forests of the South. In them, the sound of human dominion is fainter. The wind speaks in an older tongue. The trees do not seem merely to stand as trees. In their roots and in their silence, they carry the sense of an order that existed before human memory. There, that dark and ancient echo in Bloodraven's Blackwood blood must have felt nearer than ever. The part of him that had always remained slightly alien to the gilded rod of the court seemed, in the North, to find another kind of recognition. But it was not an easy kinship, nor a peaceful one. It was more like a mind that had spent long years playing the games of men, at last coming face to face with a silence older than men themselves. Such confrontations do not always cleanse a man. Sometimes they only make him less human. As the years at the Wall passed, the southern identities around Bloodraven began to thin. His being a prince became a memory from some distant age. His time as Hand, the feared web of spies, the silent dread he inspired at the tables of lords, all of it began to fade amid snowstorms, night watches, maps, and rangings into the North. But none of it vanished. It only sank deeper. And so Bloodraven came to carry two different pasts within the same body. On one side, he was still the man of history books and court whispers. On the other, he was becoming something that belonged to the silent order of the North. It was as if each year, each winter, each long night drew him a little farther from recorded history and prepared him for something else. Then came 252 years after Aegon's conquest, and this long transformation reached a great threshold. That year, Bloodraven rode beyond the wall on a ranging. Told like that, it can sound dry, but what happened here was not merely an expedition. It was the opening of a gate between visible history and something beyond it. For years, Bloodraven had always watched over other borders, the border between legitimacy and rebellion, between loyalty and betrayal, between order and decay. Now he was crossing the last boundary of the known world itself. To go beyond the wall is not merely to add a few more miles to the north. It is to step into the place where the map men trust begins to grow thin. Beyond that line, the roads belong less and less to humankind. And there, to be lost does not simply mean that no one can find where you are. It means being erased from the recorded face of the world. That he never returned from that journey does not feel like a simple disappearance. If word came of a man's death, history could place him within itself. If he fell in battle, his name would be fastened to a date, a place, a witness. But what happened to Bloodraven was not like that. He vanished beyond the wall, and for him, that word carries a peculiar weight. For all his life, Bloodraven had been a man who found the hidden paths of others, who tried to drag the unseen into view, who gave disappearance no easy refuge. And now he himself was being erased in the silence of the north, in a way the records of history could no longer reach. In that moment, the last visible thread tying together his official life in the south and his official life in the north was cut. What remained after him were rumors, and for the first time, Bloodraven's name began to slip fully from history toward legend. He had long been spoken of with fear. Yes, stories had long gathered around him, but at the center of those stories, there had still been a man one could touch. A man who carried a sword, gave commands, sent letters, and crushed rebellions. Now, other kinds of words began to circle around his absence. Ancient beings in the forest, shadows that spoke to ravens, lost patrols, an old Lord Commander whose name was whispered low in the darkness beyond the wall. The world could no longer hold him in its grasp, yet it could not let him go either. For some men do not vanish when they are lost. They change form. That is why the truth that came later does not feel like some sudden revelation, but more like shapes slowly emerging through a long night. Beyond the wall, intertwined with roots, shadows, ravens, and the memory of ancient trees, that being was the final form of the man once known as Brynden Rivers, the last green seer. To treat that title like a burst of glittering magic would be to do Bloodraven an injustice. His transformation was never showy. It was cold, patient, and hard-earned. All his life, he had been a man trying to see the secrets of others. Now he had sunk his roots into a memory older than mankind itself. The man who once kept watch over the future of kings was now bound to the past remembered by the trees. To imagine him here as some wise enchanter would erase both the darkness of his life and the tragedy of it. For Bloodraven, within that cave and within those roots, does not become a purified figure, cleansed of all the sins of the South. He is still the marked child, still the one-eyed man, still the man who made terrible decisions in the name of necessity. But now another layer has settled over all of that. He no longer belongs to a single dynasty or to a single war. Within the roots, the ravens, and the memory of the weirwoods, he has become part of something older than politics. Human memory may be narrow, fragile, and stained by self-interest, but the memory of the trees is colder. It endures longer, it forgives less, and forgets less. And it is into that ancient memory that Bloodraven's final form has passed. And this final form does not close the story. It extends it into another time and toward Bran Stark. Bran's arrival does not feel like some random piece added later to Bloodraven's tale. On the contrary, it feels like the strange continuation of everything Brynden Rivers had been becoming throughout his life. Bloodraven was once a child marked from the beginning. Now another child, with a broken body and an opened gaze, comes into his cave. Once, Brynden lived to watch over the future of kingdoms. Now he passes on to a child of another age, a far older, far heavier form of seeing. That is why Bran is not merely a student, nor only a visitor. He is the bearer of Bloodraven's final purpose, and that is precisely what makes the connection so powerful. Bloodraven's life does not end in exile. It does not end in disappearance. It does not even end with his binding to the roots. That life finds a second continuation in the eyes of another child, Bran Stark, a broken boy born of the old blood of the North, is called to inherit the final function of Bloodraven, who was once a bastard prince of the South. This is neither a comforting legacy nor a simple bond between teacher and student. Something stranger, something more unsettling endures here. It is as though Bloodraven, throughout his entire life, had always been living for the sake of the next pair of eyes. And now, after that long road, when we look at Bloodraven's final meaning, it begins to seem as though no single name can fully contain him. To call him Brynden Rivers is not enough. To call him Bloodraven is not enough either. Once he was Aegon's marked bastard son, a child born into a poisoned dynasty, carrying the sign of ill omen on his face while still in the cradle. Then he became the man whose arrows decided wars. Then the shadow of the state, smothering rebellions before they could be born. Then in exile, a black brother, the Lord Commander of the Wall. Then a lost name. Then, in the silence of a cave surrounded by ravens, roots, and snow, the last green seer. This is neither the clean arc of a rise nor the simple shape of a fall. It holds loyalty and cruelty alike, service and betrayal alike, the mind of a man and the surrender of that mind into a memory older than man. What makes Bloodraven great is that all of these things were gathered into a single body, because even in his final form, the human tragedy within him is never erased. Even if he is imagined among the roots, half tree and half spectre, he was once a living man of flesh, wounds, ambition, and fear. He saw his brothers, killed them, or gave the order that led to their deaths. He protected kings and stained kingdoms. He kept the throne standing, but in doing so, he tore himself away from the human world. The ancient and vast memory he finally reached does not offer him any clean absolution. It offers, instead, a silence in which everything he did continues to echo on another scale. That is why Bloodraven's end should be read neither as salvation nor as punishment alone. It is the final form of a man who carried the logic of his own life all the way to its furthest edge. All his life, he watched. In the end, he became the watching itself. And so the chronicle closes here. All the crowns of the South, all its councils, all its battlefields drift away beneath the snow. What remains is the long shadow of a crimson mark upon a child's face, of a single eye, of black wings, of an ancient memory sunk deep into the roots. The man who was once the marked son of a poisoned dynasty spent his life watching kingdoms from the shadows. In the end, he slipped beyond history itself and became part of a memory, colder, older, and longer lived than kings. The names of kings grow dim banners rot. Even the causes of civil wars are half forgotten in time. But some names pass out of human memory and into the memory of the world. Bloodraven was one of them. He was born a marked child. He kept kingdoms standing by dark and hidden means. And in the end, he stepped out of history's final line and disappeared into the ancient silence of the north. And there, he may still be watching. And so Bloodraven's story passes beyond kings and wars and is lost at last in the ancient silence of the north. If you enjoyed this dark journey, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, share your thoughts and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what hour of the night it is there.